The most powerful man in the Pacific Northwest stood in front of a locked vault and could not open it. 25 specialists. Every tool known to modern security, every system failed. Then a woman nobody had ever truly looked at, a housekeeper carrying a jeweler's screwdriver, knelt beside the door and opened it in 60 seconds. That moment started a war, and the woman in the gray uniform had no idea she had just made herself the most dangerous person in the room. If you want to know how a woman nobody noticed brought down a man everyone feared, stay with me until the end, and drop your city in the comments below. Let me see how far this story has traveled. The storm hit Cedar Ridge at 9:30, and by the time the first alarm sounded in the subterranean security corridor of the Bellini estate, the rain was coming in sideways off the mountains, and the power had already flickered twice. Lena Carter was on her knees in the East Wing bathroom scrubbing calcium deposits off the marble tile grout when she felt the floor vibrate. Not the shudder of thunder, something mechanical, something below her. She sat back on her heels and listened. The vibration stopped. Then the lights in the corridor outside cut to backup amber, and the intercom crackled with a voice that had lost its professional composure. "The vault is locked. Primary seal engaged. Requesting all senior security personnel to sublevel 2 immediately." Megan set her scrub brush on the cart. She didn't move right away. She had learned in 8 months working inside this house that the fastest way to become invisible was to stay exactly where you were and look like you were doing exactly what you were supposed to be doing. She pulled a clean cloth from the cart and began wiping the faucet handles. Through the open door, she watched 2 men in black jackets jog past without glancing at her. She counted to 30. Then she pushed her cart toward the service elevator. The sublevel of the Bellini estate was not something that appeared on any architectural permit filed with Clallam County. It had been built in stages over 11 years, each phase contracted to a different construction crew. No single team ever seen the full picture. The vault itself sat at the end of a corridor lined in poured concrete and rated to withstand a Category 5 detonation at close range. Megan had cleaned that corridor twice a week since September. She knew its sounds the way she knew her own apartment. The hum of the climate control, the low-frequency pulse of the motion sensors, the particular silence the concrete held after midnight when the house settled. What she heard when the elevator doors opened was none of those things. The corridor was full of men. There were specialists in gray jumpsuits with equipment cases open on the floor. There were people in suits holding tablets showing diagnostic readouts. There were 2 men she recognized as the estate's head of security. Cortez, a former military contractor built like a reinforced door, and beside him, a younger man she didn't know, already sweating through his collar. In the center of all of them stood the door. Megan had seen the vault door hundreds of times without ever giving it particular thought. It was simply part of the corridor, the way the concrete walls were part of the corridor. But now, under the amber backup lighting with 20 people moving around it like it was the body of something dangerous, it looked different. The main wheel was still. All 4 locking pins were seated. The biometric panel on the right side was dark. Whatever had engaged the primary seal had also killed the power to the access panel, which meant the standard emergency override, a backup battery bypass that every vault of this generation was required to have by federal security code, was not responding. That was interesting. Megan parked her cart against the far wall near the utility access panel and began to straighten the supplies. No one looked at her. A man with a German accent and a tablet tucked under his arm was explaining something to Cortez. The physical locking mechanism has engaged at all 4 points simultaneously. The manual override on this model is located here. He pointed to a narrow recessed strip along the door's left edge. But it requires the emergency power cell to be intact. The power cell appears to have discharged completely, which should not be possible given that these cells are rated for 200 hours of continuous backup. The cell is less than 6 months old. "Can you get it open?" Cortez said. Not a question. The kind of statement that expected a yes. The German man's jaw moved. Not without the backup power functioning. We would need to either restore power to that cell, replace it with a compatible unit, or drill. "Drilling that door will take 14 hours, said someone else. 12, said someone else. 11, with the right equipment. "We don't have 11 hours, Cortez said. Megan had stopped pretending to organize her cart. She was watching the left edge of the vault door where the German man had pointed. There was something there, in the recessed strip, that wasn't sitting right, a gap in the seam that shouldn't exist, barely a millimeter. But she had learned to trust millimeters. Her grandfather had pressed that principle into her so many times during her childhood that it had settled into something close to instinct. The small thing that doesn't fit is always the thing that matters, Maggie. She pulled a jeweler's screwdriver from the cart's lower shelf. She kept 3 of them in her kit. She'd started carrying them after she'd repaired a grandfather clock in the east wing that no one else in the house had noticed had stopped working because no one else in the house looked at clocks they didn't own. She crossed the corridor. The men didn't move for her or against her. She was simply not part of their awareness. She knelt in front of the left edge panel and held the screwdriver near the gap she'd seen, close enough that she could feel the faint draw of air. Not much, just enough. The emergency power cell on this model of vault door was a sealed lithium unit mounted behind a secondary access plate. The secondary access plate was secured by 4 flathead screws and was not, technically speaking, meant to be opened except during scheduled maintenance by certified personnel. But Megan had repaired enough complicated machines to know that the people who designed them almost always built in a way to reach the working parts, because they knew the working parts would eventually need to be reached. She found the first screw in 12 seconds. It was recessed beneath a thin layer of touch-up paint, the same paint that had been used on the corridor walls, which told her the access plate had been painted over during the last cosmetic renovation without anyone thinking through what they were painting over. That kind of carelessness was not malicious. It was simply the error of people who looked at surfaces instead of systems. She had the plate off in 40 seconds. The emergency power cell was seated behind it in a spring-mounted cradle. She could see immediately what had happened. The cell was rotated 90 degrees out of alignment. Not missing, not dead, just turned. A quarter turn counterclockwise, which broke the contact points and read to the diagnostic system as a complete discharge. This was not the result of a manufacturing defect. The contact points on this model were not reversible by accident. To rotate the cell out of alignment, someone had to open this access plate, turn the cell deliberately, close the plate, and allow the paint to cure back over the seam. Someone had done this on purpose. Megan stared at the cell for 2 full seconds. Then she reached in, seated her fingers on the cell casing, and rotated it back to correct alignment. She heard the contact click. She heard the biometric panel on the right side of the door power back on with a low electronic tone. Then she heard silence, complete silence, because every person in that corridor had stopped moving and was looking at her. She sat back on her heels and looked up at Cortez. "Power cell was rotated out of contact," she said. "The panel's live now." Cortez stared at her with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite confusion, but something sitting between them that didn't have a clean name. He looked at the German specialist. The German specialist looked at the access plate on the floor, the screwdriver in Megan's hand, and the now illuminated biometric panel on the vault door, and he did not say anything for a long moment. "Who are you?" Cortez said. "Megan Carter. Housekeeping." He looked at his tablet. He looked back at her. "Open it," he said to the German specialist. Not to her. She was already invisible again. The specialist stepped up to the biometric panel and entered the override sequence, and the vault opened with the low, pressurized exhale of a door that had been designed to hold the world out. Megan picked up the access plate from the floor, picked up her screwdriver, and walked back to her cart. She was almost at the elevator when she heard the footsteps behind her. Not Cortez, someone else, heavier, deliberate. She turned. Luca Bellini was not what people expected when they heard the name. He was not large. He was not visibly threatening in the way of men who wanted you to know they were threatening. He was 44 years old, lean, with dark hair that was starting to go at the temples and gray eyes that gave nothing away. He was dressed the way he always dressed in the evenings. Dark trousers, a collarless shirt, the kind of clothes that cost more than most people earned in a month, but were designed to look like they didn't. He was holding a glass of water, and he was looking at Megan Carter the way he had never looked at her before, like she was there. "You've worked in this house for how long?" he said. 8 months. "And you carry a jeweler's screwdriver on your supply cart." "I carry 3. He looked at the cart. He looked back at her. Why? Megan considered several answers. Because the East Wing grandfather clock stopped working in October, and nobody else noticed. I don't know what grandfather clock you're referring to. That's my point. He was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable quiet. The quiet of a man who was used to silence and had learned to use it as information. The cell was deliberately rotated, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. You're certain? The access plate had been painted over. That takes time and planning. He drank from the water glass. He looked past her at the vault door, now standing open, the German specialist and his team already inside. Then he looked back at Megan. Come to my office tomorrow morning, he said. 7 o'clock. I have a shift at 6. Your shift is rescheduled. He walked past her toward the vault. 7 o'clock, Ms. Carter. She watched him go. The elevator arrived. She pushed her cart inside and stood with her back against the wall as the doors closed and the cage lifted upward through the dark interior of the house. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed that with something close to surprise. They should have been shaking. She thought about the access plate, the careful quarter turn of the cell, the paint over the seam that had been applied with enough skill that it had taken her a close look to find the gap. Whoever had done that had known exactly what they were doing. They had known the layout of the door's internal systems. They had known which access plate to open and how to close it in a way that would pass a visual inspection. That was not the work of someone who had stumbled into the Bellini organization. That was the work of someone who had been inside it for a long time. The elevator opened into the East Wing corridor and Megan pushed her cart toward the supply room. The house was still moving around her. Voices, radios, the sound of heavy footsteps crossing marble, but the corridors she walked were empty, the way they were always empty when she moved through them. She thought about her brother Ethan, who was asleep right now in their apartment 22 miles north of here. And she thought about the fact that tomorrow morning she was going to sit in the office of Luca Bellini and tell him what she believed about his vault. She thought about that for a long time. In the supply room, she checked her cart, counted her tools, filled out the cleaning log with the precise, unhurried handwriting her grandfather had insisted on. A clean record is a clean mind, Maggie. She returned the jeweler's screwdrivers to their case, zipped the case, and placed it on the shelf. Then she sat down on the supply room stool and allowed herself to think about what the rotation of that cell actually meant. The vault lock had not failed. It had been triggered. A deliberate act conducted by someone with access to the vault corridor, knowledge of the door's internal systems, and the foresight to disguise the sabotage as a mechanical failure. The storm had provided cover. A power surge was the obvious explanation, and every specialist in that corridor had spent the first 30 minutes chasing electrical fault diagnostics because the storm was there, and the mind goes toward the explanation that's already in the room. Whoever had rotated the cell had counted on exactly that. They had counted on the storm, which meant they had either been very lucky or they had known the storm was coming and had chosen the timing. Neither possibility was comfortable. But there was a third problem, and it was the one that sat with her all the way through the drive home in the pre-dawn dark, all the way through the 3 hours of sleep she managed before her alarm went off, all the way through the drive back to the estate as the storm cleared and the mountains emerged bone white and enormous against the pale sky. The access plate had been painted over. The paint had cured. That process, with the materials available in the estate's maintenance supply room, took between 3 and 5 days at the ambient temperature of the sublevel corridor. The power cell had been rotated at least 3 days before the storm. Someone had planned this. They had planned it carefully, and they had executed it from inside the house. When she pulled through the estate gate at 6:50 and parked in the staff lot and walked toward the main entrance, she thought about the vault corridor and the 25 specialists and the way Luca Bellini had looked at her. She thought about the fact that she had, without meaning to, just stepped directly into the middle of something that was not hers. She didn't yet know how deep the middle went. She would find out in approximately 8 minutes when she sat down across from a man who had spent his entire adult life making sure that no one who knew his secrets was ever in a position to speak them, and told him what she believed about the person he trusted most. She pushed through the service entrance and walked down the corridor toward the main wing, and she did not yet know that the man who had rotated that cell had already been told about her. She did not yet know that by the time she reached Luca Bellini's office door, someone in that house was already deciding what to do about Megan Carter. The office door was heavier than it looked. Megan noticed that when she pushed it open at exactly 7 o'clock, the weight of it, the way it moved on its hinges with the smooth resistance of something engineered to slow a person down before they entered the room. She filed that away the way she filed everything away. Not because she had decided to be observant, but because her brain had been wired since childhood to collect the details that didn't announce themselves. Luca Bellini was already at his desk, not behind it, beside it. Standing with one hand resting on the surface and the other holding a phone, he sat face down when she came in. The desk was clean in the way that desks belonging to powerful men are always clean, which is to say someone else had made it that way. The window behind him faced east, and the morning light was coming in sharp and cold off the mountain snow, cutting across the floor in a long pale rectangle. He did not tell her to sit down. He looked at her for a moment the way he had looked at her in the corridor the night before, and then he pulled out the chair across from the desk and gestured at it with 2 fingers. She sat. He sat across from her, not behind the desk, across from it, in the other chair, which put them at the same level and the same distance from the window and removed the architectural advantage the desk would have given him. She noticed that too. "Tell me what you told me last night," he said. "All of it. Don't leave anything out because you think it's too small." Megan looked at him. The cell was rotated deliberately. The access plate was painted over and the paint had cured, which takes 3 to 5 days at sub-level temperature with the materials your maintenance team stocks. Someone opened that plate at minimum 72 hours before the storm. Before the storm. Whoever did it planned around the storm. Either they got lucky with the timing or they knew it was coming and used it. He was quiet, not reacting, processing. She had noticed the night before that he didn't perform his responses. He held them until they were complete, which was unusual for men in his position, because men in his position were almost universally accustomed to the room reshaping itself around their reactions. Luca Bellini did not seem to need the room to reshape itself. "That access plate," he said. "How did you know it existed?" "I've cleaned that corridor twice a week for 8 months. I know what the wall looks like." Most people who've cleaned that corridor don't know what the wall looks like. Most people aren't looking at the wall. He put his elbows on his knees and laced his fingers together. He had a scar across the left knuckle, old and faded, the kind that comes from something sharp rather than something blunt. He looked at his hands for a moment and then looked back at her. "I'm going to ask you something, and I want a direct answer." "Okay. Who do you think did it?" The room held the question. Outside, somewhere on the estate grounds, she could hear a groundskeeper's utility vehicle moving across gravel. She looked at the window and then back at Luca. Someone with access to the sub-level corridor who knows the vault system well enough to identify the emergency power cell housing and understand that rotating it would read as a discharge rather than a disconnection. That's not general knowledge. That's specific. Whoever did it has either studied the vault's engineering documentation or has had enough time inside that corridor to work it out themselves. She paused. "I can't tell you who. I can tell you it isn't a new employee." Something moved in his face. Not much. A tightening around the eyes that might have been anger or might have been recognition of something he'd already half known. "I want you to look at something," he said. He stood up and went to the desk and opened the center drawer and pulled out a manila folder. He brought it back and held it out to her. She took it. Inside were printed pages, financial summary sheets, account ledgers formatted in columns, a series of wiring confirmations with dates spanning the last 14 months. She was not an accountant, but she was someone who had spent 2 years of coursework in engineering systems before she dropped out, and engineering systems and financial systems had more in common than most people understood. They were both built on sequences, and sequences had to be internally consistent or they broke. She went through the pages slowly. Page 4 had a column that didn't reconcile. The debit entries from a subsidiary account were 6 digits higher than the corresponding credit entries in the main ledger, and the difference had been distributed across 9 transactions over 7 months in amounts small enough that they wouldn't trigger an automated flag individually. She pointed at the column. This doesn't balance. No, Luca said, it doesn't. How long have you known? I've suspected something for about 6 weeks. Cortez found an irregularity in the quarterly audit and brought it to me without documenting it. I asked him to keep it between us while I looked at it. Who manages these accounts? Luca looked at her steadily. My financial advisor, a man named Daniel Reyes. He's been with this organization for 11 years. Megan looked back at the pages. 11 years was long enough to understand the vault. 11 years was long enough to know the maintenance schedule, the supply room inventory, the paint drying times in a sub-level corridor. 11 years was long enough to plan very carefully and to wait. She set the folder on her knee. Do you want me to keep looking at these? I want you to tell me whether what you're seeing in those numbers could be connected to what happened to the vault. She didn't answer immediately because she was thinking about it honestly rather than reaching for a response that would be useful to him. The question was whether a financial irregularity and a physical act of sabotage were part of the same operation or two separate problems that happened to exist simultaneously. The answer was that they could be either, but the more interesting question was why someone who had been stealing carefully and slowly for 7 months would suddenly do something as disruptive and visible as locking the vault. If someone was quietly moving money out of your organization, she said slowly, they would want your attention focused outward, on enemies, on competitors, not on the inside. A vault failure during a storm is exactly the kind of thing that pulls your security team into emergency response mode and keeps them looking at systems instead of people. She looked up at him. But they couldn't have predicted I would find the cell. They expected this to take 12 hours of drilling, maybe longer. That's 12 hours of your security team's complete focus on a mechanical problem. The room was very quiet. Luca stood up. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the mountain. When he turned around, his face had settled into something flat and controlled and entirely without warmth. I want you to go through every document in that folder, he said. Every page. I want to know every number that doesn't fit. I'm going to have additional files sent to a secure terminal in the East Wing Library. I'll give you access this morning. You'll work from there. You don't discuss what you're doing with anyone on the domestic staff. You don't discuss it with Cortez. You don't discuss it with anyone in this house except me. Megan looked at the folder in her hands. She thought about Ethan, who was probably eating cereal right now and watching something on his laptop, who had no idea where his sister was or what she was being asked to do. She thought about the fact that she was a housekeeper, and what she was being asked to do was not housekeeping by any definition that would appear on her employment contract. My clearance level in this house is domestic staff, she said. As of this morning, it isn't. That's not a formal process. No, he said, it's not. She held the folder. If I find something significant, what happens to the person I find it about? He looked at her with those gray eyes that gave nothing away. That depends on what you find. It was not a reassuring answer. She hadn't expected it to be. She took the folder. The East Wing Library was a room that had been built to look used without actually being used. Shelves of matched leather volumes that had never been opened. Reading chairs positioned at angles that suggested contemplation. A fireplace that smelled of decorative ash. The secure terminal Luca's assistant had set up was an intrusion into the room's performance of itself. A flat screen and encrypted keyboard that sat on the reading table with 4 hard drives and a printer that Megan had not asked for but understood she would probably need. She worked through the morning without stopping. The files were dense. 11 years of financial architecture spread across subsidiary companies, holding structures, and accounts distributed through 3 different banking jurisdictions. It was, she had to admit, an elegant construction. The kind of structure that worked precisely because it was complicated. Each layer of complexity added another degree of separation between the person controlling it and the money moving through it. Most people looking at it would have given up after the 3rd subsidiary and concluded that it was simply the natural opacity of a large private financial operation. But most people had not been trained by a watchmaker who believed that the most important skill a person could possess was the patience to follow a mechanism all the way to its end. She followed it. By noon, she had mapped 9 shell companies. By 2 in the afternoon, she had identified a pattern in the withdrawal timing that was keyed, with a precision that made her jaw tighten, to the Bellini organization's own cash flow cycles. Whoever had structured this knew when the main accounts were at their highest balances and had timed the outgoing transfers to occur in the 48-hour window before the quarterly audit sweep, when the numbers would be most obscured by legitimate high-volume transaction activity. That was not the work of someone guessing. That was the work of someone who read the organization's internal financial calendar. At 3:15, she heard the library door open behind her, and she did not turn around until she had finished the line she was tracing, because she had learned that the moment you looked up was the moment you lost the thread. It was Cortez. He stood in the doorway with his jacket on and his arms at his sides, and he looked at the screen and the files spread across the table, and then he looked at her. "Mr. Bellini said you'd be in here," he said. "He told me to work here." "He told me that too." Cortez came into the room and closed the door behind him. He was a man who moved like someone who had spent a long time in environments where movement needed to be economical and purposeful. He stopped at the edge of the table and looked at the files. "What are you finding?" Megan looked at him. She thought about what Luca had said that morning. "You don't discuss it with Cortez." She thought about why a man would say that about the head of his own security operation, and she thought about the fact that Cortez was the one who had found the original irregularity and brought it to Luca without documenting it, which meant Cortez was either the most loyal person in this organization or the most dangerous. "I'm still working through the structure," she said. "Nothing conclusive yet." Cortez looked at her for a long beat. He had the kind of face that had been organized by years of not showing what it felt, which meant that when something showed through, it was worth paying attention to. What showed through now was not hostility. It was something closer to worry. "Be careful," he said. She waited. "Whatever you find in those files," he said, "be careful about how you present it. And to who?" He paused. "There are people in this organization who have been here a very long time, people Mr. Bellini trusts in ways that go beyond evidence." He looked at her for one more second. Then he left. Megan turned back to the screen. She worked through the afternoon and into the early evening, and by the time the mountain outside the library window had gone dark against the sky, she had found it. Not a suspicion, not an irregularity, a trail. Complete and sequential and documented in the files with the accidental thoroughness of someone who had been so certain the structure was invisible that they had stopped being careful. $11.3 million, moved across 23 months through 7 shell companies, each transfer individually small enough to avoid flags, collectively large enough to fund a significant operation. The final destination account in the chain was registered in the Cayman Islands to a holding company called Meridian Structural Partners, which had been incorporated 3 years ago and had made no other financial transactions of any kind except to receive these transfers and, in the last 4 months, to make a series of outgoing payments. She traced the outgoing payments. They went to 3 different entities. One was a private security contractor based in Nevada. One was a data forensics firm registered in Delaware. The third was a company called Cascade Risk Solutions, which had no public profile, no registered employees, and an address that corresponded to a mail forwarding service in Tacoma. She stared at Cascade Risk Solutions for a long time. Then she cross-referenced it against the other documents in the sublevel files, the ones she'd been granted access to in the afternoon that covered operational security contracts rather than financial records. Cascade Risk Solutions appeared once, in a contract rider attached to the estate's last major security upgrade, 18 months ago. The rider specified a consultation fee for Independent Systems Vulnerability Assessment. The consultation had been arranged by Daniel Reyes. She sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling and let the full shape of it settle. Reyes had paid a company he controlled to assess the vulnerabilities in the Bellini estate's security system. Under the cover of a legitimate consultation, he had acquired detailed documentation of every system in this house. The vault, the sublevel access protocols, the emergency power systems, the biometric override sequences. He had bought himself a blueprint, and then he had waited. For the right storm, for the right moment, for whatever was coming next that she didn't yet understand, but that $11.3 million and a private security contractor and 2 years of careful preparation suggested was not small. She was printing the last page of the document chain when her phone buzzed on the table. An unknown number. She almost didn't answer it. Then she picked it up. Miss Carter. The voice was male, measured, with the particular smoothness of someone who had practiced sounding reasonable for so long it had become reflexive. I understand you've had a productive day. I wanted to reach out directly, colleague to colleague, before things become more complicated than either of us wants. Her hand was very still on the phone. Who is this? Someone who would like to offer you a perspective you may not have considered. A brief pause. The documents you're reviewing have a context that isn't visible in the numbers alone. I'd like to share that context with you. Tonight, before you take what you believe you've found to Mr. Bellini. She looked at the printed pages in the tray. She looked at the door. I don't think I want to meet with someone who won't tell me their name, she said. My name is Daniel Reyes, the voice said, and I think you already know that. The line stayed open. She could hear him breathing on the other end, patient and unhurried, the way a man breathes when he believes he controls the situation. There's a service road on the north side of the property, he said. It runs along the tree line toward the old equipment shed. I'll be there at 9 o'clock. Come alone and come without telling Mr. Bellini, and I'll explain everything you think you've found in a way that will make considerably more sense than whatever conclusion you've reached. Another pause, softer this time, almost solicitous. You're a very intelligent woman, Ms. Carter. I'd hate for that intelligence to be wasted on the wrong side of this conversation. The line went dead. Megan set the phone down on the table. She looked at the printed documents. She looked at the phone. She thought about calling Luca and decided that calling Luca right now meant armed men on the North Service Road within 5 minutes, which meant Reyes would see them coming and she would lose the only chance she might have to hear what he thought he could offer her. She thought about what Cortez had said. Be careful about how you present it. And to who? She thought about Ethan, asleep in their apartment, who had no idea that his sister was sitting in a library inside a crime lord's estate, holding 11 million reasons why someone in this house wanted the whole structure to come down. She picked up the documents and folded them into her jacket. At 8:40, she walked out through the service entrance and into the cold night air, and the mountain dark closed around her like a hand, and she walked toward the tree line, knowing with absolute certainty that the man waiting for her in that darkness was not going to offer her a perspective. He was going to show her exactly how far he was willing to go, and she was stepping directly into the middle of that answer with nothing but a folded set of papers and the quiet, stubborn refusal to pretend she hadn't seen what she'd seen. The equipment shed light was on when she reached it, a yellow rectangle in the black tree line, and she stopped walking 20 feet from the door and stood in the dark and waited, because her grandfather had taught her one more thing she had never forgotten. The person who enters the room first is always at a disadvantage. The shed door opened. Daniel Reyes stepped out into the cold, and he was smiling, and behind him, just visible in the yellow light, were 2 other men who were not smiling at all. She did not move toward the light. That was the first decision, and she made it in the half-second between seeing the 2 men behind Reyes and understanding what their presence meant. They were not assistants. They were not colleagues brought along for the conversation. They were positioned, one at the doorframe, one slightly to the left with his weight already shifted forward, in the way that men are positioned when their function is to prevent a specific outcome rather than facilitate one. Reyes stepped out of the yellow rectangle and onto the cold ground, and his smile stayed exactly where it was, which told her the smile was not a response to anything. It was a tool he had put on before he came outside. Ms. Carter, he said, thank you for coming. You brought company, she said. They're here for my protection. This is an isolated location at night. I'm sure you understand. She understood that she was standing 20 feet from a man who had spent 2 years building a shadow empire inside someone else's organization, and that she had walked out here alone and told no one where she was going. She understood that the folded documents inside her jacket were the only copies of the printed trail she had assembled because she had not yet sent anything to the secure terminal's encrypted backup, because she had printed and left in the same motion without stopping to think about redundancy. That was a mistake. She filed it away and did not allow herself to spend more than 1 second on it. Say what you want to say, she said. Reyes clasped his hands in front of him. He was a man in his early 50s with a face that had been built for boardrooms. Composed, symmetrical, the kind of face that made people feel they were being listened to even when they weren't. He wore a dark coat and no tie, and he looked at Megan with an expression of genuine, careful attention that she recognized as the most dangerous kind of performance. "What you found today in those files," he said, "is accurate. I'm not going to insult your intelligence by telling you the numbers are wrong or that you misread the structure." She said nothing. "What I'm going to tell you," he continued, "is that the picture you've assembled is incomplete, and an incomplete picture presented to a man like Luca Bellini will get you killed. Not as a consequence, not as a possibility, as a certainty." The wind came through the tree line from the north, and she felt it across her face, and she kept her eyes on the two men in the shed door. "You've been moving money out of his organization for 2 years," she said. "Yes." $11 million. Closer to 12 at this point. The number landed flat in the cold air. He said it without flinching because he had already decided that the confession was the opening move rather than the end of the conversation. "And you think telling me that directly is going to make me not take it to him?" she said. "I think telling you directly is going to give us a chance to have an honest conversation, which is the only kind worth having." He took one step toward her, unhurried, testing the distance. She didn't move back. "Luca Bellini is going to fall. Not because of anything you found, and not because of anything I've done. Because of what's coming in the next 30 days. His rivals in the Portland network have been building toward a move against him for 14 months. I have documentation, operational plans, names. The attack on the vault last night was not just sabotage, Ms. Carter. It was a signal. Someone in his inner circle is already coordinating with Portland." She looked at him. "Someone other than you." Something shifted very slightly behind his eyes. "Yes." "And you've known about Portland for how long?" "Long enough to have built an alternative." She understood then what he was offering. Not an explanation, a recruitment. He had spent 2 years building something outside the Bellini organization, and whatever was coming in 30 days was the moment he intended to step into the space that collapse would leave behind. He needed her to not take the documents to Luca. He needed the next 30 days to complete something she didn't yet have the full shape of, and he had decided, for reasons she would need to think about carefully, that buying her silence was preferable to the alternative his two associates represented. "What do you want from me?" she said. "Walk away from the library terminal tonight. Take what you printed and burn it. Go back to your shift in the morning and clean the marble and wind the grandfather clock and be exactly what everyone in that house believes you are. In 30 days, this is over and Luca Bellini is no longer a factor, and the people who helped make that possible will be protected." She let the silence run for 5 seconds. "And if I don't?" He looked at her with those boardroom eyes, and the smile finally moved, settling into something smaller and less performed. "Then this conversation ends in a way that I would genuinely prefer to avoid. You're not what I expected, Ms. Carter. I don't have any interest in unnecessary complications." "Unnecessary complications," she said. "That's what you're calling it." "I'm calling it what it is. The two men in the doorway, are they the complication I avoid or the complication you avoid?" He looked at her for a long moment. "That depends entirely on what you decide in the next 60 seconds. She thought about the documents in her jacket. She thought about Ethan in the apartment 22 miles north. She thought about Luca Bellini and the gray eyes that gave nothing away and the scar on his left knuckle. And she thought about the fact that she had walked into this conversation because she had wanted information, and she had gotten it, but not the information she'd planned for. Someone inside Luca's inner circle was already working with Portland. That was not in the financial documents. That was not something she could have found in the files. Reyes had told her that deliberately, which meant it was either a manipulation or it was true, and he told her because he wanted her to understand that the ground under her feet was less stable than she thought. She looked at the man on the left side of the shed door. He had his right hand inside his coat. "I need 24 hours, she said. Reyes looked at her. "That's not one of the options." "I understand. I'm telling you what I need." She held his gaze. "You just told me there's someone in this organization feeding information to Portland. If I walk back into that house tonight and hand Luca a financial document trail without knowing who that person is, I'm handing him a fire extinguisher while someone else is cutting the gas line. That helps nobody. Not him, Not you. Not me. She kept her voice flat and even. Give me 24 hours to identify the Portland contact. Then we talk again. The wind came through again. Reyes was quiet. She could see him working through the calculation, which meant he was actually considering it, which meant the name of the Portland contact was something he either didn't have or didn't want to give her for reasons that were not yet clear. 12 hours, he said. 24. He looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded once, a small, precise movement, the nod of a man who had just made a decision he was not entirely comfortable with. Tomorrow night, same location, 9 o'clock. He reached into his coat and produced a phone, a cheap prepaid unit, and held it out. If you find something, use this. One call. Don't contact me through any other channel. She took the phone. She put it in her jacket pocket next to the documents. She walked back through the dark to the estate without looking back, and she did not allow herself to breathe fully until the tree line was 50 yards behind her and the estate lights were visible through the dark. Inside the service entrance, she stood against the wall for a moment with her eyes closed and her jaw tight and her heart doing something loud and uneven behind her sternum. Then she pushed off the wall and went upstairs. She did not go back to the library. She went to the east wing corridor to the small staff bathroom near the linen storage, and she locked the door and turned on the tap and stood over the sink with the water running cold over her wrists until her hands stopped feeling like they belonged to someone else. She looked at herself in the mirror above the sink. The face looking back at her was not the face of a housekeeper. She hadn't yet decided what it was the face of. She thought about what Reyes had said. Someone in his inner circle is already coordinating with Portland. She thought about Cortez, who had come to the library that afternoon. Be careful about how you present it, and to who. She thought about the way he'd said it, not like a warning from an ally, but like a warning from someone who knew exactly what the landscape looked like and wanted her to navigate it carefully for reasons that might or might not include her survival. She turned off the tap and dried her hands and looked at the prepaid phone Reyes had given her. Then she took out her own phone and called Luca. He picked up on the second ring. Carter? I need to see you. Tonight. A pause. Not long. Where are you? East Wing. Give me 10 minutes. She waited in the corridor outside the library. She heard his footsteps before she saw him, that deliberate, unhurried pace she had come to recognize. And when he came around the corner, he was in the same clothes he'd worn that morning, which meant he hadn't left the office for most of the day either. He looked at her face, and whatever he saw there made him open the library door without saying anything. Inside, she laid it out. All of it. The documents spread back across the table, the shell companies and the shell company structure, Meridian Structural Partners, the payments to the private security contractor and to Cascade Risk Solutions, the meeting at the equipment shed, Reyes and his two men, what he'd said about Portland, the prepaid phone, all of it. Luca stood at the table and looked at the documents, and he was absolutely still in the way that a thing is still before it moves very fast. When he looked up, his face was flat and controlled, and there was something behind his eyes that she had not seen there before. Not anger. Anger was too simple a word for it. It was the expression of a man who had just watched something he had built with his hands begin to come apart, and who was deciding in real time whether to feel that or to use it. He told you someone in my inner circle is feeding Portland, he said. Yes. He didn't give you a name. No. Luca looked at the documents. He looked at the prepaid phone she'd set on the table. He put his hands flat on the table surface and leaned his weight on them. Cortez came to see you this afternoon, he said. It wasn't a question. She felt something cold move through her. Yes. What did he say? She told him, word for word. Luca listened without moving. When she finished, he straightened up and walked to the window. The mountain was invisible in the dark. He stood looking at his own reflection in the glass. 11 years, he said. Not to her. The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. She waited. I brought Reyes into this organization when he had nothing, he said. He came to me with a briefcase full of bad debt and 2 years of accounting experience, and I gave him the financial architecture of everything I'd built. He paused. I trusted him because he had no loyalty to anyone else when I found him. I thought that meant his loyalty was mine. It meant he was waiting for a better offer, Megan said. Luca turned from the window. He looked at her with that flat gray gaze, and she held it without looking away. Portland is planning a move in 30 days, he said. If Reyes has been feeding them operational intelligence for however long this has been running, they know more about how this organization functions than my own security team does. He paused. And if someone on my inner circle is actively coordinating with them, I don't know who I can put in a room with this information without it being on a phone to Portland inside the hour. Except me, she said. He looked at her. Except you. The library was very quiet. She thought about what she was about to say, and she said it anyway because she had already crossed whatever line existed between the woman who came to work at 6 in the morning with a supply cart and the woman who was standing in this room. Let me go back tomorrow night, she said. He went very still. Reyes wants me to identify the Portland contact in exchange for 24 hours. He thinks I'm going to use that time to consider his offer, but if I go back with a name, any name, real or constructed, he'll have to respond to it, and the way he responds will tell us whether he actually knows who the contact is or whether that was a manipulation to keep me off balance. You want to run a play on the man who just threatened your life? I want to find out how much of what he told me is true before you make a move that tips him off. She looked at the table. If you go at him now with what I've brought you, he'll know I gave it to you. He'll burn whatever he hasn't already moved, and the Portland coordination goes dark, and you spend the next 30 days fighting an attack from a direction you can't see. Luca looked at her for a very long time. She could hear him breathing, slow, measured, deliberate. You understand what happens to you if that meeting goes wrong, he said. I understand it better than I did 3 hours ago. He crossed back to the table. He picked up the prepaid phone and turned it over in his hands and set it back down. I'll have 2 men on the perimeter of the north tree line, he said, outside visual range. You go in, you get what you can, and if anything moves wrong, you get out. Immediately. You don't try to finish the conversation. You don't try to collect more information. You move. Agreed. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. It was not the expression of a man assessing an employee. It was something else, something with more weight behind it. Why are you doing this? He said. She thought about it honestly. Because I started it. And because the person in your organization feeding Portland is going to get people killed, and I'm the only one in this building right now who can walk into that meeting without Reyes knowing what I'm walking in for. He nodded slowly. He picked up the documents from the table and stacked them with the careful precision of a man who handled important things carefully. Go home tonight, he said. Sleep. Be back here at noon. She picked up her jacket. She was at the door when he spoke again. Carter. She turned. The cell in the vault, he said. You found something that 25 specialists missed. I want you to understand that I don't take that lightly. She looked at him. I take it lightly, she said. They were looking at the door. I was looking at the wall. She left the library and walked through the East Wing corridor and out through the service entrance into the cold, and she drove home in the dark with her hands steady on the wheel and her mind running the shape of what tomorrow night would need to look like, and she was almost at the apartment when her phone rang. Unknown number, different from the prepaid, a number she didn't recognize. She pulled over and answered. Silence for 2 seconds. Then a voice she had not heard before, younger than Reyes, with a tension underneath the words like a wire pulled too tight. You need to stop, the voice said. Whatever Reyes told you tonight, whatever Bellini asked you to do tomorrow, you need to stop and get out of that house and not go back. Her hand tightened on the phone. Who is this? Someone who knows what Reyes didn't tell you. A breath, jagged. The Portland move isn't in 30 days, it's in 4. And the person coordinating it from inside the Bellini organization isn't someone Luca suspects. Another breath. It's Cortez. The street outside the car was dark and empty. She looked at her own hands on the steering wheel. And the reason you're calling me instead of Luca, she said slowly, because Cortez has had Luca's phone tapped for 6 weeks. The voice dropped lower. Every call Luca makes from that office goes to Portland inside 20 minutes. If you told Bellini anything tonight, Reyes already knows. And if Reyes already knows, then tomorrow night isn't a meeting. The silence on the line stretched for 1 full second. Tomorrow night is a trap, the voice said, and you just walked yourself directly into the center of it. She sat in the parked car for 11 seconds. She counted them. Not because counting helped, but because her brain needed something concrete to hold on to, while the rest of it processed what the voice had just told her. Cortez. 6 weeks of tapped calls, 4 days, not 30, and every word she had said to Luca in that library tonight already moving through a wire toward Portland at whatever speed betrayal traveled. She called Luca's office line. It rang 4 times and went to the estate's internal voicemail system, and she hung up without leaving a message because if the office line was compromised, then a voicemail was a written record of everything she knew, sitting on a server that Cortez had access to. She called his cell, the number she had been given that morning as part of her revised access clearance. He picked up on the first ring. "Carter." "Don't talk," she said. "Don't say anything that matters. Listen." She kept her voice flat. "The line in the office. Don't use it. Don't use anything connected to the estate network. Get somewhere clean and call me back from a phone that hasn't touched that network in the last 6 weeks. Silence. 2 seconds. "How long?" he said. "Now. Right now." She heard him moving. A door. Footsteps. Then the call ended. She sat in the dark outside her apartment building and watched a moth work itself against the streetlight above the entrance, and she waited. 3 minutes and 40 seconds later, her phone rang from a number she didn't recognize. "Talk," Luca said. She talked. She gave him everything the unknown voice had said, in order, without interpretation. The way her grandfather had taught her to report a mechanism failure. Describe what you observed before you describe what you think it means. When she finished, there was a silence on the line that had a different quality from Luca's usual silences. This one had weight. "Cortez," he said. "That's what the voice said." "You don't know who called you?" "No, the number's already dead. I tried it while I was waiting for you." She looked at the street. "It could be a second manipulation. Reyes could have someone call me with bad information to make me burn Cortez before I can verify the financial documents. But if it's true, and Cortez has had your office tapped for 6 weeks, then everything we talked about tonight is already in Portland's hands." Another silence. "Where are you?" "Outside my apartment." "Stay there." His voice had changed. The flatness was still there, but something underneath it had tightened into something she could feel through the phone. "Don't go inside. Don't turn your apartment lights on. Don't contact anyone." "Luca, the meeting tomorrow night isn't happening," he said. "I'm pulling you out of this. If you pull me out, Reyes goes dark. You lose the trail. The trail isn't worth—" He stopped. She heard him breathe. "Just stay where you are." She looked at the phone for a moment after the call ended, then she got out of the car. She did not go into the apartment. She stood on the sidewalk in the cold, and she thought about Ethan, who was inside that building, and she thought about the fact that if Cortez had been feeding Portland operational intelligence for 6 weeks, then Portland knew about the people in Luca Bellini's orbit, and Megan Carter's name had been in Luca Bellini's orbit since approximately 7 o'clock that morning. She went inside. Ethan was on the couch with his laptop, 19 years old and completely unbothered by the hour. And he looked up when she came in and started to say something, and she crossed the room and put her hand on his shoulder. "I need you to go to Marcus's place tonight," she said. Marcus was his college roommate 2 miles east. "Pack a bag. Enough for a few days." He looked at her. He was not a stupid kid. He had his grandfather's eyes, the same patient attention that Megan had, the same instinct that something small and wrong was worth looking at. "Meg." "Please," she said. "I'll explain everything when I can. Right now I need you to not be here." He looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he closed the laptop and got up. She waited until she heard his car pull out of the parking lot. Then she stood in the dark apartment and looked at the wall and thought about the hydroelectric facility. The documents from the library had referenced Cascade Risk Solutions. Cascade Risk Solutions had been paid through Meridian Structural Partners, which Reyes controlled. But the outgoing payments she had traced in the afternoon had a 4th destination she hadn't mentioned to Luca because she hadn't fully processed it before Cortez arrived at the library door and interrupted her concentration. A facility maintenance contract for a decommissioned hydroelectric plant 40 minutes northeast of the estate, along the river corridor that ran toward the Canadian border. She had written the address on the inside cover of the folder. She could feel the folder inside her jacket, its edges pressing against her ribs. Her phone rang. Luca. Different number again. "I'm sending a car," he said. "I'm not at the apartment." A beat. "Where?" "I'm getting in my car," she said. "I need you to tell me something honestly. Do you have anyone in your organization right now, tonight, that you are certain hasn't been in contact with Cortez in the last 6 weeks?" The silence was long enough that she knew he was actually thinking about it rather than reaching for a reassuring answer. "2 people," he said finally. "Maybe 3. Can you reach them without going through the estate network or any line Cortez has had access to?" "Yes." "Then meet me." She gave him the address, not from memory, from the folder cover, reading it in the pale glow of her phone screen. "I think Reyes isn't running the operation from inside the estate. I think he has a base, 40 minutes northeast. He's been paying maintenance on a facility up there for at least a year." "Carter?" "The meeting tomorrow night was never going to be at the equipment shed," she said. "He told me the shed as a location, so I'd come to the shed and he'd control the ground. But whatever he's actually building is somewhere else. And if Portland moves in 4 days, that somewhere else is where the pieces are." She opened her car door. "I think the hydroelectric plant is where he has everything. The documentation, the stolen funds in liquid form, the Portland coordination files, all of it. And I think we have maybe 8 hours before he moves it, because he's going to assume that whatever I told Luca tonight is already being acted on." A long pause. "You're describing walking into a facility that a man with $12 million and a private security contractor has had a year to prepare." "Yes." "With no tactical team. With whatever 2 or 3 people you trust. And me." She heard his breathing on the line. She heard somewhere on his end a door close and then quiet. 40 minutes northeast, he said. "Yes." "Give me 90 minutes to reach you." She drove. The road northeast of Cedar Ridge followed the river through forests that got progressively darker and denser as the elevation dropped toward the valley floor. She drove with the headlights on low and the heater running against the cold that came off the river, and she thought about mechanisms. The vault door, the power cell, the quarter turn that had seemed like a malfunction until you looked at it correctly. Every mechanism had a logic. The logic of this one was starting to be visible. Reyes had spent 2 years building a structure designed to survive Luca Bellini's fall. He had extracted money slowly. He had commissioned a vulnerability assessment of the estate under legitimate cover. He had cultivated a contact inside Luca's inner circle. He had positioned himself to step into whatever space Portland's move created. Every piece was patient and methodical and connected to every other piece. But there was a flaw in the mechanism. The flaw was that Reyes had not anticipated the vault failing visibly. He had planned for a 12-hour drilling operation that would keep Luca's security team focused on a mechanical problem during the storm. Instead, the vault had been opened in 60 seconds by someone he had never considered, and that someone had then been placed inside the financial files by Luca himself. Reyes had tried to recover by reaching out directly, which meant the equipment shed meeting had been improvised. The meeting had been improvised, which meant Reyes had been operating slightly off his plan for the last 24 hours. A man operating slightly off his plan makes different decisions than a man executing a plan cleanly. She thought about that as she turned off the main road onto the access track that ran toward the facility. The track was unpaved and the ruts were deep from the storm runoff, and her headlights bounced across the tree trunks as she navigated it, and at the point where the track curved left, she stopped the car and turned the headlights off. She sat in the dark and looked at the facility. It was larger than she had expected. The main building was a long concrete structure following the river, its turbine housing still intact but dark. The windows on the upper level covered with what looked like black contractor sheeting from the inside. There were 2 vehicles parked along the near side, a dark SUV and a panel van. At the far end, partly visible through the tree line, there was a light source, not ambient, a generator light. Something inside was running on power. She checked her watch. 70 minutes since she'd spoken to Luca, 20 to go. She got out of the car. She did not intend to go inside. She intended to look. There was a difference, and it mattered, and she held it firmly in her mind as she moved through the tree line toward the building's near wall, staying off the gravel apron that ringed the structure. The concrete wall was cold under her hand. She moved along it toward the end where the light was, keeping low beneath the covered windows. The ground near the building was wet from the storm runoff, and her shoes went in deep twice, and she felt the cold water come through both times but kept moving. At the corner she stopped. Around the corner was a loading dock. The dock doors were open and the generator light she'd seen from the tree line was inside. 2 portable work lights on stands, the kind used on construction sites, throwing everything in the dock area into hard white contrast. There were 4 men she could see. 2 were moving crates. One was working at a folding table covered in equipment she couldn't identify from her angle. The 4th was standing with his back to her, talking on a phone, and she recognized the coat before she recognized the posture. Cortez. She pressed herself against the corner wall and breathed. In, slow, out. Cortez was inside the facility, which meant he was not at the estate, which meant his absence from the estate, in the middle of what he would have known was an active crisis based on whatever Luca had said on the tapped office line tonight, was not an absence he was trying to hide. He had left openly. Or he had left before Megan had called Luca on the clean line, before Luca had had any reason to look at where Cortez was. She pulled back from the corner and went back along the wall. She was 15 feet from the corner when the loading dock light shifted and she heard the dock door mechanism, and she went flat against the wall and did not breathe. Footsteps on the gravel apron. 1 person, moving toward the tree line. She heard them stop. Silence. 15 seconds. 20. She heard the footsteps come back toward the building, and then a voice. Cortez's voice, low and clipped, said something she couldn't make out, and then the dock door closed. She let the breath out. She got back to her car. She sat behind the wheel and looked at the facility and thought about the crates and the work lights and the folding table and Cortez on the phone, and she texted Luca the single word she had agreed with him would mean confirmed target, come now. Then she waited, and while she waited, she took the documents from her jacket and went through them one more time in the pale glow of her phone screen, and she found what she had not had time to find in the library because Cortez had interrupted her. There was a name on the Cascade Risk Solutions Incorporation documents. She had missed it in the afternoon because it appeared not as a principal but as a registered agent, which was the kind of secondary listing that incorporation documents required but that most people never looked at because it was typically a lawyer's name or a compliance firm. The registered agent for Cascade Risk Solutions was not a lawyer. It was an individual. And the name was not Daniel Reyes. The name was Marco Bellini. She stared at it. Marco Bellini was Luca's younger brother. He had left the organization 6 years ago. She knew this from the staff briefing documents she'd been given during her onboarding, the ones that outlined the family structure in enough detail to know who not to admit to the property without clearance. Marco had left, according to those documents, due to a disagreement over the organization's direction. He lived in Seattle. He had no active role, except that his name was on the incorporation documents for a shell company that had received $12 million from the Bellini organization's stolen funds. And the company had been incorporated 3 years ago, 1 year before Reyes had begun moving money. She heard the sound of a car on the access track. 2 cars, headlights coming through the trees. Luca. She got out and walked to meet him in the dark, and she knew that what she was about to show him was not going to land as information. It was going to land as a wound. He came out of the first car alone, the 2 men he'd brought staying near the vehicles, and he crossed the wet ground toward her with that deliberate pace, and she held the incorporation document out to him without saying anything. He took it. He looked at it in the light from his phone. She watched his face. She had seen him absorb difficult information before. The financial documents, the vault, the revelation about Cortez. Each time the face had gone flat and controlled, the reaction sealed behind something professional and impenetrable. This was different. Something moved through his face that was not controlled. It lasted less than 2 seconds, but she saw it. A crack in the surface that went all the way down, a flash of something raw and specific that had nothing to do with his organization or his money or his empire and everything to do with the name on the page. Then it was gone. The flat gray control came back like a door closing. Marco, he said. Not a question, not even a statement, just the name, held in his mouth for a moment like something he was testing the weight of. "His name is on the incorporation," she said. "As registered agent. He's been in this from the beginning, before Reyes started moving money. Reyes needed someone inside to coordinate the timing. Marco would have known the organization's financial calendar. He would have known Cortez. He would have—" "I know what he would have known," Luca said. The quiet after that was the worst kind. The kind that has too much history packed into it to be moved through quickly. She heard something from the facility, a door, voices, then the sound of the panel van's engine turning over. They were moving. Luca heard it too. He looked at the building and then back at her, and whatever had cracked in his face was gone entirely now, replaced by something hard and decisive and entirely without hesitation. "Stay behind the vehicles," he said. "Luca!" He was already moving toward the facility with his phone to his ear, and his two men were moving with him, and the panel van's headlights were sweeping through the dock door as it backed toward the loading area, and from inside the facility she heard Cortez's voice rising in pitch and volume, and she pressed herself against the side of Luca's car and watched the night come apart. The dock doors blew open. The van came out fast and wrong, not backing, accelerating forward, aimed at the access track rather than the road, and one of Luca's men went sideways to avoid it and went down on the gravel, and the van's rear corner caught the equipment shed wall and took a chunk of concrete with it as it went. Luca was at the dock. She heard his voice, 2 words, flat and absolute, and then another voice inside responding, and then the unmistakable sound of something heavy hitting the concrete floor. She came off the car. She went through the dock door and into the white work light, and the facility opened up around her. High concrete ceiling, rusted turbine casings along the far wall, the folding table still covered in equipment and files. 2 of the crates open and empty, and on the floor near the table, breathing hard through his nose with his hands behind him, was Cortez. Luca was standing over him. The second man was at the dock door behind her. At the far end of the facility, past the turbine casings, there was another door. It was swinging shut. "Reyes," she said. Luca looked up from Cortez. He looked at the door. He looked at her. She was already moving. The door opened onto a service corridor running parallel to the river, and the corridor was dark except for the emergency strip lighting along the floor. And she ran its length with the cold concrete walls close on both sides, and her footsteps loud against everything. And she came out into the turbine access level and found herself standing on a metal grate walkway above the old turbine pit, with the sound of the river loud and immediate beneath her. Reyes was on the walkway, 20 feet away. He was holding a hard drive case in one hand and his phone in the other, and when he turned and saw her, his face went through something fast and unpleasant. "Miss Carter," he said. He sounded almost tired. She looked at the hard drive case. She looked at him. "It's over." "Nothing is over." He looked past her toward the corridor door. "Luca's here." "Yes." "And Cortez?" "Cortez is on the floor." Something moved across his face. Recalculation. She could see it happen, the rapid internal adjustment of a man whose plan had been running 2 steps ahead for 2 years and had just found out that the gap had closed. "Marco," she said. He looked at her. "I found his name," she said. "On the Cascade Incorporation. Luca has it." The recalculation stopped. Reyes looked at the hard drive case in his hand. He looked at the river below the grate. "Don't," she said. He looked at her with something she had not expected from him, which was exhaustion. Genuine, bone-deep exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying something heavy for too long in a direction that turns out to be wrong. "You understand what happens now," he said. "Yes." "To me." "Yes." He looked at the river. He looked at the case. Then the corridor door behind her opened and Luca came through it and onto the walkway, and the metal sang under his weight, and Reyes turned to face him. The 2 men stood on the grating above the river with 20 feet between them and 11 years of something that had not been friendship but had been close enough to its shape that its absence now had a specific gravity. Reyes looked at him. "Luca." Luca looked at the case. He looked at Reyes. He said nothing. "I built half of what you have," Reyes said. "The financial structure, the offshore holdings, the tax architecture, you know that." "I know it," Luca said. And you paid me a salary, Reyes said, for 11 years. A salary, while I built an empire for someone else. You were compensated. I was managed. The exhaustion in his face had sharpened into something harder. Like a resource. Like a mechanism you needed functioning, not like someone who'd given you 11 years of his life. The walkway hummed with the river sound beneath them. Megan stood between them and felt the vibration through the soles of her shoes. "Where is my brother?" Luca said. The question landed like a stone. Reyes looked at Megan. He looked back at Luca. "Seattle. He doesn't know you're here tonight. He thought this would be clean." "Nothing about this is clean," Luca said. "No," Reyes said quietly. "I suppose it isn't." He set the hard drive case down on the grating. He set it down carefully, with both hands, the way you set down something you've been carrying for a long time and have finally decided to put on the ground. He straightened up and looked at Luca and waited. Luca crossed the 20 feet between them and stopped an arm's length away, and for a moment the two men just looked at each other on the metal walkway above the black river with the cold coming off the water and the work lights from the facility casting long shadows through the door behind them. Then Luca reached down and picked up the hard drive case. He looked at Megan. "Call Cortez's replacement. Tell them we need 3 cars at this location." She nodded. She pulled out her phone. She was dialing when she heard the sound from the far end of the service corridor. Not the dock door, the other one, the one that led to the exterior staircase along the river wall. And she turned and the door opened, and the man who came through it was not one of Luca's 2 men. He was younger. She had never seen him before. But the way he looked at Luca with that specific combination of recognition and something that wasn't quite hatred, but had its shape told her who he was before he opened his mouth. Marco Bellini stopped in the doorway of the corridor and looked at his brother across the length of the service passage, and the river was loud beneath them, and nobody moved. "I told you not to come," Reyes said, his voice sharp with something close to panic. Marco didn't look at Reyes. He was looking at Luca. 6 years, Marco said. His voice was quieter than she'd expected. 6 years since you told me I didn't have the judgment to be part of this. Since you sat across from me and told me I was a liability. He stepped onto the walkway. I've spent 6 years building something that was going to show you exactly what my judgment was worth. Luca looked at his brother. The thing that had moved in his face when he'd read Marco's name on the document, that raw, specific crack, was back, but different now. Because Marco was standing in front of him in the flesh rather than on a piece of paper, and a piece of paper could be folded up and put away. "And this is what it looks like," Luca said. "It would have worked," Marco said. "Another 4 days." "It didn't work," Luca said, "because I had someone looking at the wall instead of the door." Marco looked at Megan. It was the first time he had acknowledged her presence, and the look was not hostile. It was something stranger than that. The look of a man who understood, in one direct assessment, exactly what had happened to his plan and why. He looked back at his brother. The walkway hummed. The river moved below them in the dark. "What happens now?" Marco said. Luca held the hard drive case and looked at his brother, and the silence stretched until it had no more room to stretch. And in that silence, Megan Carter stood between 2 men who had grown up in the same house and had spent 6 years building the structure of their mutual destruction. And she thought about mechanisms and the things that hold them together and the things that make them come apart. And she thought that the most complicated mechanisms she had ever encountered were not made of steel and springs and precisely fitted gears, but of the particular irreversible damage that people who love each other are capable of doing when they decide that being right matters more than anything else. Luca opened his mouth to speak, and in that moment, before the words came, she knew that whatever he said next would determine not just the fate of the 2 men on this walkway, but the entire shape of everything that came after. And that once it was said, there would be no mechanism in the world precise enough to take it back. Luca said his brother's name. Just the name. Nothing attached to it. No accusation, no question, no weight that had been deliberately placed. Just Marco, spoken the way you speak a word you have not said aloud in a long time and are surprised to find still fits in your mouth. Marco looked at him. The river moved below the grating with the particular indifference of water that has no opinion about the men standing above it, and the work lights from the facility threw everything into that hard white contrast that made faces look more exposed than they were prepared to be. Megan stood to the side with her phone in her hand and did not move, because this was not a moment that belonged to her, and she understood that clearly. "I'm not going to pretend I didn't know what you were building," Luca said. Marco's jaw tightened. "Then why?" "Because knowing and understanding are not the same thing." Luca set the hard drive case down on the grating beside him. He did not look at it. He looked at his brother. "I knew you were angry. I knew you thought I dismissed you. I told myself you'd get past it." He paused. "I was wrong about that." Marco looked at him with 6 years of something hard and compressed behind his eyes. "You told me I didn't have the judgment. I told you that you made a decision that cost us a significant relationship with the Vancouver network. That's what I said. You said it in front of Reyes, in front of Cortez, in front of every person in that room." Marco's voice was quiet, but had a vibration underneath it like a cable under tension. "You humiliated me, and then you told me to step back, and I did. And then 6 months later you told me to step further back, and I did that too. And at some point, Luca, stepping back becomes something else." The walkway held both of them. Megan watched Luca absorb this, not deflect it, not reframe it, actually absorb it, the way a man absorbs information he already half knows, but has never allowed himself to hold still long enough to look at directly. "Yes," Luca said. "It does." Marco blinked. It was a small movement, but it was the movement of a man who had prepared for many responses and had not prepared for that one. "That doesn't make this right," Luca said. "Cortez, Portland, $12 million. Whatever was coming in 4 days. None of that becomes right because I handled something badly 6 years ago." "I know it." "Then tell me why." Marco looked at the river below the grate. He looked at his hands on the walkway railing. He looked at Reyes, who was standing very still near the corridor door, with the expression of a man who has understood that the situation has moved entirely beyond his ability to influence it. "Because I needed to prove something," Marco said finally. "Not to you, to myself. And proving it required building something that could—" He stopped. He pressed his lips together. "I told myself it was about the money, about the principle. But it wasn't." He looked up at his brother. "It was about walking back into a room where you were and having you understand that you were wrong, that your judgment about me was wrong." The silence after that lasted long enough to have texture. "I was wrong," Luca said. Marco looked at him. "I was wrong about how I handled it," Luca said. "I'm not wrong about what I'm going to have to do tonight." Marco nodded once, a small, precise movement. The nod of a man who has known this part was coming and has decided to meet it without flinching. Megan looked at Reyes. Reyes was looking at the hard drive case on the grating. He had the face of a man who had spent years calculating and had finally arrived at the end of his calculations and found that the sum was not what he had expected. "The Portland network," she said. Reyes looked at her. "The operational plans you said they had. The move in 4 days. If Cortez was the coordination point, and Cortez is in custody inside this building, who's managing the Portland side of this?" Reyes was quiet for a moment. "A man named Varga, operations director. He's been the primary contact for 14 months. "Does Varga know about tonight?" "Not yet. Cortez was supposed to signal him at midnight. It's—" Reyes checked his watch. 11:47. 13 minutes. She looked at Luca. He was already looking at her. "The signal," she said. "What form does it take?" Reyes turned to look at Cortez's direction, as if the answer was in the room where Cortez was being held. Then he looked back. A text, specific phrasing, from Cortez's personal phone. "Where's Cortez's phone?" "He had it when—" Reyes paused. "When your man put him down. He would still have it." Luca moved first. He went back through the corridor door and Megan followed him, and they crossed the service corridor and came back into the main facility space where Cortez was on the floor with Luca's man standing over him, hands still bound behind him with the flex restraint from the man's kit. Cortez looked up when Luca came in. His face was composed, or trying to be, but there was sweat on his forehead that had nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with the particular private terror of a man who has been caught by someone whose respect he valued, whatever else he had done. "The phone," Luca said. "Left jacket pocket," Cortez said. His voice was steady. She gave him that. Luca's man retrieved it. He handed it to Luca. Luca looked at it and then held it out to Megan. She looked at him. "I don't know the phrasing." Luca looked at Cortez. Cortez looked at the floor. Something moved across his face. The last calculation of a man deciding whether the thing he was being asked to give up was worth protecting. "Clear," Cortez said. "Just the word. That's the all-clear signal." Megan took the phone. The screen was locked. She looked at Cortez. 6 digits, he said. 284193. She entered it. The phone opened. She found the thread. A contact listed only as V, no surname, no other identifier. The last message in the thread was from 3 days ago, a single word, confirmed. She typed the word Cortez had given her and held the phone out to Luca. He looked at it. He looked at Cortez. "If this is wrong," Luca said. "It's not wrong," Cortez said. He said it without inflection, without appeal. Just a statement of fact from a man who had decided that this, at least, he could give cleanly. Luca sent the message. The read receipt came back in 40 seconds. Then a reply. Acknowledged. Standing by. The Portland move had just been walked back from its 4-day timeline without Portland knowing it. Whatever operational coordination Cortez had been providing was now silenced, and the signal that would have triggered Varga's action had been replaced with a hold instruction that would buy time to be dealt with through channels that didn't involve Lena Carter standing in a decommissioned power plant at midnight. She handed the phone back to Luca's man. She walked to the folding table and looked at the equipment laid out on it. 3 additional hard drives, a portable router, a document scanner, a portable drive shredder, still plugged into the generator line, that had been interrupted mid-operation. She could see the partially processed drive still in its slot. She unplugged the shredder. Whatever was on that drive was going to matter to someone. Behind her, she heard Luca on the phone, the clean phone, the one he'd called her back on, speaking in a low, clipped voice to someone she didn't know, giving an address and a number of people and saying words like contained and transport and no documentation until I've reviewed. She heard the specific silence in his voice when he was managing something that was costing him more than he was allowing to show. She sat down in the chair at the folding table and looked at her hands in the work light. Her shoes were wet through. She hadn't noticed until now. The cold from the wet ground had climbed to her ankles, and she hadn't noticed because there had been too many other things to notice. Which was the thing about emergencies. They consumed the body's attention so efficiently that you didn't feel the small physical miseries until the emergency was over, and then you felt them all at once. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed that again, the same way she had noticed it in the service elevator 2 nights ago. They should have been shaking. By any reasonable accounting of what she had been through in the last 24 hours, her hands should have been shaking considerably. She thought about her grandfather, about his workshop behind the house, the smell of machine oil and old wood and the particular focused quiet of a man doing the thing he was built to do. He had told her once, when she was 11 and frustrated because she couldn't reassemble a pocket watch she'd taken apart, that the hands that don't shake are not the hands of someone without fear. They're the hands of someone who has found the right thing to be afraid of and has decided to deal with it rather than run from it. She had been afraid tonight. She had been afraid from the moment she walked out toward the equipment shed and seen the 2 men in the doorway behind Reyes. She had been afraid in the car outside her apartment, and afraid on the access road, and afraid on the walkway above the river. The fear had been there throughout, a precise and specific thing, not large enough to stop her because it had never spread into panic, had stayed exactly the size and shape of the actual threat rather than growing into something that filled all available space. That was what her grandfather had given her, not courage, proportion. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. It was Luca. He pulled a crate close to the table and sat on it, and for a moment neither of them said anything. They sat in the work light with the sound of the river coming through the walls and the sound of men moving in the corridor and the distant sound of cars on the access road. "The Portland situation," she said. "Varga. Being handled." He looked at the table. "Not tonight, but it will be handled. The money. What Reyes moved. Most of it is recoverable. The shell company structure is documented now. It'll take time, but it's not gone. He paused. The Cascade account has enough liquid to be a problem if it reaches the wrong hands before we can freeze it. I have someone on that. She nodded. She looked at the partially processed drive in the shredder slot. This was running when we came in. I saw it. Whatever is on it was important enough to destroy immediately. That suggests it might be more important than what he was taking with him. Luca reached over and extracted the drive carefully from the shredder slot. He held it in his palm and looked at it. I know someone who can recover partially shredded drives. It takes time. Most things that matter take time, she said. He looked at her. Something in his face was different from every other time she had looked at it. The flatness was still there, the gray-eyed control, but there was something beneath it that was no longer sealed away. Not exposed exactly. More like acknowledged. The difference between a wound that's been dressed and a wound that's been dressed and looked at, honestly. Marco is going to have to go away for a while, he said. Not because I want him to, because there are people in my organization who need to see a consequence. If they don't see one, everything I do next is done without their belief that the rules apply to everyone. I understand. I'm not sure I do, he said. He said it quietly, without self-pity, an honest statement. He's my brother. And he did what he did because I made him feel like he had to prove something to me. And now I have to make him go away. And both of those things are true simultaneously, and I don't know what to do with that. She thought about Ethan, asleep at Marcus's place. She thought about the way she had sent him away tonight without explanation, and the way he had not asked for one because he trusted her, and she thought about what that kind of trust actually cost the person who held it. You do what's in front of you, she said, and then you do the next thing. And at some point there's enough space to figure out what the rest of it means. Luca looked at her for a long moment. Is that experience talking? My grandfather died when I was 21, she said. I had 2 years of engineering school and a 19-year-old brother and a lease on an apartment we couldn't afford. I didn't know what I was doing for a long time. I just kept doing the next thing. She looked at her hands. Some days the next thing was making sure Ethan ate breakfast. Some days it was showing up somewhere I didn't entirely belong and fixing something nobody else had noticed was broken. He was quiet. You're good at that, he said. The fixing. I'm good at looking at walls, she said. Most people look at the door. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something more worn in than a smile, which made it more real. Outside, more cars had arrived. She could hear voices, controlled, professional, the organized movement of people handling a situation according to an established protocol. Luca's network, or part of it, the part that hadn't been compromised, functioning the way it was built to function now that the interference had been removed. She stood up from the chair. I should call my brother, she said. Yes. He stood too. He looked at her across the folding table with its hard drives and its equipment and the work light throwing everything into clear, unambiguous relief. What you did tonight? I looked at the wall, she said. Carter. Megan, she said. He looked at her. Megan. He said it like he was placing it where it belonged, in the category of things that had their correct name and should be called by it. What you did over the last 2 days is not something I know how to adequately account for. Then don't account for it tonight, she said. Tonight's not the right time for that kind of arithmetic. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. She walked toward the dock door, and at the threshold she stopped because something had occurred to her, one last piece of the mechanism that she hadn't quite set down properly. She turned back. The unknown caller, she said. The one who told me about Cortez and the 4-day timeline. I never found out who it was. Luca looked at her. Something moved in his face. A very small thing. The kind of thing she had learned to pay attention to. No, he said. You didn't. She looked at him. You knew about Cortez. I suspected, he said, for about 72 hours. I didn't have confirmation, and I didn't have anyone I trusted to confirm it with, because the list of people I could trust had become very short, and I didn't know how short until... He paused. until a housekeeper opened a vault in 60 seconds and started looking at walls. "The caller," she said. "Someone I trust completely," he said. "Someone who's been watching Cortez from outside the organization for the last 2 months at my request. When you went to that equipment shed alone, I made a call." He held her gaze. "I wasn't going to let you walk into that alone without someone watching the thread." She thought about the voice on the phone. Young, tightly wound. Someone who had been close enough to the situation to know about Cortez and the tapped phone and the 4-day timeline, but not present in any of the rooms she'd been in. She thought about the way the information had been given. Precise, urgent, and calibrated exactly to what she needed to know to make the right decision. "You could have just told me," she said. "You would have asked me how I knew," he said, "and I would have had to tell you I'd already suspected Cortez and hadn't acted yet, and you would have asked me why." He looked at the concrete floor. "Because I wanted to be wrong," he said. "Cortez has been with me for 14 years. I wanted to be wrong about him." She stood in the dock doorway for a moment. The cold air came in from outside and she felt it on her face, and she thought about all the things that had happened in the last 48 hours and the fact that at the center of all of it, the vault and the power cell and the financial documents and the equipment shed and the walkway above the river and Marco Bellini's name on a piece of paper. At the center of all of it was something very simple. A man who had built an empire on control and had spent years protecting that empire from enemies who existed outside it, while the damage accumulated from within. Not from malice, most of it. From the ordinary human failures of pride and assumption and the particular arrogance of someone who had been right so many times that he had stopped checking. "Get some sleep," she said, "when this is cleaned up, before you do anything else." He looked at her. "Is that a recommendation?" "It's an observation," she said. "You look like a man who's been right about everything for a long time and has just found out what the cost of that is. That kind of reckoning needs sleep, not decisions." She went out through the dock door into the cold. The cars were there, 3 of them. Luca's people moving in and out of the facility with the organized efficiency of people who did this kind of work and did it without drama. Nobody looked at her with particular interest. She was to them what she had always been to the people in Luca's orbit, someone adjacent to the main event. Someone whose presence was noted and then set aside. She was getting used to that. She was also getting used to the fact that it no longer bothered her the way it once had, because she had learned something in the last 2 days about the difference between being noticed and being seen. Being noticed was what happened when you did something that disrupted someone else's expectations. Being seen was something rarer, something that required a different quality of attention from both sides, and it happened much less frequently and mattered much more when it did. She sat in her car and called Ethan. He picked up on the second ring, groggy and uncertain, and she told him he could go back to the apartment in the morning. She told him she was fine. She told him she would explain everything, not tonight, but soon, and she meant it in a way she had not always meant that particular promise. "Are you okay?" he said. Not accusatory, just the direct, patient question of someone who knew her well enough to ask it plainly. "I'm okay," she said. "Something happened." "Several things happened. I'll tell you about them." She looked at the facility, its concrete bulk dark against the tree line, the work lights still visible through the dock door. "How's Marcus?" "Asleep. He didn't even ask why I showed up at midnight." A pause. "Meg, whatever it was—" "I know," she said. "Sleep. I'll call you in the morning." She drove back through the forest road with the headlights on full and the heater working against the cold that had settled deep into her feet and ankles during the hours of standing on wet ground. The mountains were invisible above the tree line, but she knew they were there, the same way she knew that the mechanisms she couldn't directly observe were still running. The Portland situation, the Cascade account, the partially destroyed drive from the shredder, the long process of understanding exactly how deeply Cortez's betrayal had reached into the organization's operations. All of that would take time. Time and patience and the willingness to follow every thread to its end, rather than stopping when the most obvious answer presented itself. She could do that. She had been doing that since she was 11 years old in a workshop that smelled of machine oil, learning that the small thing that doesn't fit is always the thing that matters. The estate came into view through the trees, its lights burning against the dark in the way that large, fortified things burn their lights. Not as welcome, but as statement. She pulled through the gate and parked in the staff lot out of habit and sat for a moment before getting out. She thought about the vault, the door she had opened, the power cell in its spring-mounted cradle, turned 90 degrees out of alignment by careful, patient hands, designed to look like a failure rather than a choice. Every mechanism has a story. She had learned a great deal about this particular mechanism in the last 2 days. The story it told was not simple. It was not the story of a housekeeper who turned out to be special, or a billionaire who learned humility, or a betrayal exposed and punished. Those were the surface shapes. Underneath them was something older and more persistent. The story of what happens when people are defined by the role they play in each other's lives, rather than the truth of who they actually are. Reyes, the advisor who became the architect of destruction because 11 years of loyalty had been received as 11 years of utility. Marco, the brother who became a saboteur because one humiliation in front of witnesses had been allowed to calcify into identity. Cortez, the protector who became a traitor for reasons she still didn't fully know and might never fully know, because people's reasons for the things they do are rarely as clean as the things themselves. And Lena Carter, the housekeeper, who was not just a housekeeper, who had never been just a housekeeper, even when she was wearing the gray uniform and pushing the supply cart through marble corridors that didn't register her presence. She had always known what she was. She had simply not had occasion to demonstrate it. An occasion had found her on a stormy night in a sublevel corridor with a jeweler's screwdriver. She got out of the car. The estate was quieter than it had been in 2 days. A few lights in the upper windows. The security desk visible through the lobby glass, running on a skeleton staff she didn't recognize, which told her that whatever Luca had put in motion from the clean phone was already being implemented. A reorganization of the security operation that would need to account for every position Cortez had touched, every protocol he had been party to. That was going to be a long process. She went in through the service entrance. The corridor was empty, and the amber backup lighting had been replaced with the full corridor lights, which meant the main power system had been tested and verified in the hours since the vault incident, another item on the list of things the estate needed to work through. She went down to the sublevel. The vault door stood open. Someone had left the corridor lights on full, and the door was simply open, standing wide, the way you leave something open when you're done with the idea of keeping it closed. She walked the length of the corridor and stood in the open vault door and looked inside. It was a room, just a room, shelving, files, several secured cases, the climate control running its low hum. The ordinary contents of a room that had been built to be extraordinary and had, in the end, been opened by a jeweler's screwdriver. She looked at the left edge of the door frame. The access plate she had removed was still leaning against the wall where she'd left it. The power cell was still seated in its correct alignment, contact points closed, the biometric panel on the right side of the door active and steady. She picked up the access plate and seated it back into the door frame. She pressed it flush and checked the gap around the edges. Even. Clean. She took a flathead from her jacket. She had put it back in her pocket at some point in the last several hours without thinking about it, and tightened the 4 screws back into their threads, snug but not torqued, the way the manufacturer intended. She pressed the plate flat with her palm and held it there for a moment. Then she put the screwdriver back in her pocket and walked back through the corridor to the elevator and went up. 3 weeks later, the East Wing grandfather clock stopped working again, which was not a surprise because the mainspring had been showing wear for 6 weeks, and Megan had been watching it the way you watch something that is going to need attention eventually and waiting for the eventually to arrive. She took it apart on the library table with the tools spread out on a clean cloth, the same way her grandfather had taught her, each piece laid in the order it came out so that reassembly was just the process run in reverse. The mechanism was small and precise, and the problem, when she found it, was exactly what she had expected. A hair-thin crack in the mainspring that had been propagating slowly and had finally propagated enough to lose tension. She replaced the spring from the supplies she had ordered 2 weeks ago when she'd first noticed the wear pattern. She reassembled the clock. She wound it and set it on the library table and listened to it begin to tick. That particular, satisfied sound of a mechanism running correctly, each component doing the thing it was built to do in sequence with every other component. Luca came into the library while she was putting the tools away. He had been doing that in the last 3 weeks, appearing in rooms she was working in without announcing himself, which was not what he had done in the 8 months before that. Before, he had been the person who moved through the house while she was invisible in it. Now they occupied the same rooms with a different quality of mutual awareness, which was something she had not entirely decided what to do with, but which felt, on its better days, like the beginning of something honest. He looked at the clock on the table. "You fixed it," he said. Mainspring was cracked. "I didn't know it was broken." "You don't look at the clock," she said. "You look at the time." He looked at her with that expression she had come to recognize, the one where something almost reached the surface and then didn't quite, which was not evasion, but habit. The habit of a man who had learned to manage his responses so thoroughly that the management had become second nature. He was getting better at letting it surface, slowly. But she had learned to read mechanisms, and she could see the change even when it was small. He sat down at the library table. She sat across from him. The clock ticked between them with its small, steady sound. "The Cascade account has been frozen," he said. "The recovery process will take several months, but the principle is intact." "Good." "The Portland network." He paused. "Varga agreed to a meeting through an intermediary. The situation is," he chose the word carefully, "resolvable. It will require time and a different kind of engagement than what was being planned." "Also good." He looked at the clock. "Marco left for Vancouver this morning." She said nothing. "It was his choice," Luca said. "The distance. He wanted it. He said—" He paused again. "He said he needed to figure out what he was building toward rather than what he was building against." He was quiet for a moment. "I think that's the most honest thing he said to me in 6 years." She looked at the clock. At its face, the hands moving through their circuit, the mechanism inside doing what it was built to do. "Cortez," she said. "Being handled through the appropriate channels. It's not—" He stopped. 14 years, he said. "I keep thinking about that. 14 years and I don't know when it started to go wrong. If I should have seen it." "You might not have seen it," she said. "Some things go wrong slowly. They don't look like they're going wrong while it's happening. They look like normal wear." He looked at her. "What matters," she said, "is what you do with it now. Whether you use it as information going forward or as a reason to trust nothing." "I trust you," he said. He said it simply, without preparation, without the measured delivery he usually brought to statements of significance. It just came out, the way things come out when a person has been holding them for long enough that the hold finally gives. She looked at him across the library table. "You barely know me," she said. "I know how you move through a problem," he said. "I know you don't stop when it gets difficult. I know you put the access plate back on the vault door at 4 in the morning after the night you had, because it belonged there and you were the one who'd taken it off." He looked at his hands on the table. "I know you sent your brother away to protect him before you knew how the night was going to end, which means you thought ahead to the possibility that it wasn't going to end well, and you protected him anyway." He looked up. "I think that tells me most of what matters about a person." The clock ticked. The library held them both in its quiet, the shelves of unread books and the reading chairs positioned for the performance of contemplation, and the terminal that had been removed last week, leaving a clean rectangle on the table's surface where it had sat. "I'm going to need someone to rebuild the security architecture of this organization," he said. "From the review process outward. Someone who looks at the wall rather than the door." He held her gaze. "Someone I can trust to tell me when I'm wrong." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the supply cart and the gray uniform and the marble corridors and the 8 months of invisibility. She thought about her grandfather's workshop and the engineering degree she had set aside, and the life she had built around what was necessary rather than what she wanted, and the way those two things were finally, slowly, beginning to look like they might not have to be separate from each other. "That's a significant role," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." She looked at the clock on the table. It ticked steadily, reliably, doing what it had been built to do now that the broken piece had been replaced. Okay, she said. He looked at her. Okay. I'll need full access to every system, no exceptions. Agreed. And I'll need the maintenance supply room restocked. The paint inventory specifically. If someone ever paints over another access plate in this building, I want it to be because the color looked bad, not because they didn't have anything else in the cabinet. Something happened in his face that had not happened before, in any of the rooms she had been in with him over the last 3 weeks. It was not the controlled, almost smile she had seen before. It was the actual thing, brief and unguarded and entirely real, gone in a second, but there long enough to matter. I'll have it done this week, he said. She nodded. She picked up the tool cloth and folded it and placed it on the shelf behind her and stood up and looked at the clock one more time. Every mechanism has a story, her grandfather had told her, and the ones worth fixing always have a moment, a small, precise moment, usually unremarkable from the outside. When the broken piece is replaced and the whole thing begins to run again, she could hear it running now. She left the library and walked down the east wing corridor toward the service stairs, and the house was quiet around her, and the morning light was coming in through the tall windows and laying itself across the marble floor in long, pale rectangles. And she walked through it without rushing, taking the time to notice things the way she always had and always would, because that was who she was. And the world had finally given her enough room to be it.